The market was just waking up, the scent of fried dough mixing with the cold morning air. Traders shouted over one another, dragging crates and setting up stalls, while sleepy children clung to the hems of their mothers' wrappers. In a narrow alley just off the main street, Sophie tied her scarf around her head, picked up her cloth bag, and stepped out into the bustle. She had a soft face, the kind that made people pause, not because she was stunning, but because she carried a quiet kindness that was hard to ignore. Every morning, before her first shift at the bakery, she would buy 2 extra bread rolls, one for the blind man near the bus stop, and the other for the old woman who sat under the tree with swollen legs. She never had enough, but somehow she always gave. Sophie was only 23, but life had forced her to grow up early. Since her parents passed away in a car crash 5 years ago, she'd become the only family her younger brother Caleb had left. He was 15 now, cheerful and intelligent, but paralyzed from the waist down after a fall at school. Their dream was simple: to save enough for his surgery. They lived in a room no bigger than a garden shed, a rented space behind a tailor's shop, just off the main road. The walls were damp, and the tap outside rarely worked, but it was home, and it was better than the streets. Because Sophie had known that too. Just a year earlier, they'd spent 3 freezing nights under a bridge after she'd lost her cleaning job. Still, through it all, she never complained. She worked 2 jobs, one at the bakery in the morning and the other as a cleaner in the afternoons at a big house on Hillside Crescent, a place so posh she never dared look too long at the curtains. The house belonged to the Sampsons. Mr. Sampson, or simply Samson as everyone called him, was a reserved man in his early 30s. Wealthy, quiet, always polite. The kind who opened doors for people, even if they were workers. He had studied abroad and returned to run his father's company after his death. Though many women tried to catch his eye, Samson remained single, not uninterested, just cautious. He lived with his mother, Mama Grace, a regal woman with an iron spine and a sharper tongue. Mama Grace wasn't just rich, she came from what she called true class. To her, money was only half the value of a person. The rest: background, bloodline, and behavior. And when it came to her son's future wife, she had a checklist. Educated. From a respectable family. Elegant, poised, preferably the daughter of someone important. Most importantly, not someone from the street. So when Mama Grace saw Samson speaking kindly to Sophie one afternoon, just a simple thank you after Sophie offered to help carry some bags, she frowned. She didn't like it. Not one bit. Later that evening, as Samson sat in the study reading, Mama Grace sat in her room, thinking. A thought came to her, a plan, rather. If her son wouldn't look closely enough at the people around him, she would. But not in the way anyone would expect. She would become someone else. Someone no one would suspect. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a line of determination. Sometimes, she muttered, you need to go low to see how low others really are. And so, unknown to her son, to Sophie, or to anyone else in the house, Mama Grace began to prepare. Old clothes. An oversized handbag. Shoes that had seen better days. She was going to test the hearts of young women. Not with interviews. Not with questions. But with real situations, moments that revealed character when no one was watching. But what Mama Grace didn't realize was that she wasn't just about to test someone. Life was about to test her. And in the quiet corners of this bustling city, on cracked pavements and in overcrowded buses, a story was about to unfold. A story of kindness, pride, secrets, and regrets. This wasn't just about love. It was about what happens when you judge a soul by its shoes. And how sometimes, the one you looked down on, is the one who ends up lifting you. She thought she was testing others, but life was about to test her instead. Rain poured down in thick sheets, turning the roadside gutter into a small stream. Cars rushed past without slowing, splashing muddy water onto the broken pavement. Beneath a crooked sign near the market, an old woman sat on a torn mat, soaked to the bone, her shawl doing little to stop the cold. A battered bag sat beside her, stuffed with what looked like old clothes and tattered newspapers. That woman was not who she appeared to be. It was Mama Grace. Wrapped in layers of old fabric and grey powder dusting her face to age her looks, she had become Maggie, a poor, homeless beggar to the world around her. She sat silently, watching. Waiting. Testing. Every morning and evening for over a week, she returned to that same corner. She saw hundreds of young women pass by. Most ignored her completely. Some stared and turned away. Others whispered and laughed, muttering things like, "Why doesn't she just go to a shelter?" or "Dirty old woman." She watched it all. Took mental notes. One girl had fancy nails but shoved past her without so much as eye contact. Another, holding a takeaway cup, scoffed when Mama Grace softly asked for help. But then came that rainy Thursday evening. Sophie was on her way home from the bakery, her shoes soaked, her coat clinging to her skin. She paused when she saw the woman huddled by the roadside. Her brows furrowed. She stood for a moment, clearly torn. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small food flask, one she'd been saving for dinner with her brother. Beans and bread. Warm, still steaming. She knelt beside the woman and held it out with both hands. "Ma, please eat this. I don't have much, but it should warm you up," she said gently. Mama Grace blinked, taken aback. She opened her mouth to refuse, but Sophie smiled faintly and added, "My brother and I will manage. You need this more." Then, without hesitation, Sophie picked up the old woman's heavy bag. "There's a shed behind the corner shop," she said. "It's not much, but it's dry. Let me walk you there." Mama Grace said little, just nodded. But deep down, something shifted. She began watching Sophie more closely after that. From a distance, of course. She learned where Sophie lived. She saw how she took care of her brother Caleb, how she never asked neighbors for favors or complained about her struggles, how she always greeted people kindly, even those who ignored her. Days passed. Then fate intervened. Samson, needing a stand-in maid while one staff member traveled, hired a temporary cleaner through an agency. The girl walked in wearing simple clothes, eyes lowered in respect. Mama Grace stood frozen in the hallway. It was her. The same girl from the roadside. Sophie. Now she was in her home. From that moment on, tension grew in Mama Grace's chest. She tried to avoid Sophie. Tried to convince herself it was coincidence. But each time Sophie helped without being asked, each time she smiled despite being tired, it ate away at the walls Mama Grace had built. She was being shown something her pride didn't want to see. And though she had set out to test hearts, Mama Grace now found hers being tested most of all. The morning sun filtered through the white curtains, casting soft light across the sitting room. Sophie was on her knees, wiping the legs of the coffee table with quiet focus. The scent of lemon cleaner drifted in the air, and the soft hum of birds outside gave the house a peaceful air. But peace was about to shatter. A knock echoed at the front door. Sophie paused, still on the floor. She turned her head slightly, peeking toward the corridor. From the study, Mr. Sampson emerged with a smile already forming on his face. He walked briskly to the door, fixing his shirt collar as he opened it. "Mum," he exclaimed, stepping forward into a warm embrace. Sophie straightened slowly, the towel still clutched in her hand. She could just about see them from where she stood. Her heart skipped. But then she saw the woman's face. And everything stopped. Her body froze, eyes wide. The towel slipped from her fingers to the tiled floor with a soft thud. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. It was her. The old woman from the roadside. The one who'd been shivering in the rain, clutching a bag of rags. The same woman she had fed with her last meal. The one she had walked to shelter, whose heavy bag she had carried. Now dressed in elegant fabric, clean, upright, and carrying a polished handbag. "Mama D," Sophie whispered under her breath, barely audible. Mama Grace, now fully herself again, froze mid-step. Their eyes locked. A beat passed. Then another. The hallway felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. "Sophie," Mama Grace said quietly, blinking in disbelief. Mr. Sampson, still smiling, looked between them. Confusion crept onto his face. "Wait," he said, moving into the room. "You two know each other?" Sophie looked down, her hands trembling at her sides. She nodded slowly, still in shock. She began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Mama Grace inhaled deeply, eyes still fixed on Sophie, then turned to her son. "Samson," she said, her voice suddenly heavy with emotion. "We need to sit." The three of them gathered in the sitting room. Sophie sat on the very edge of the chair, her heart thudding in her chest. Samson crossed his arms, clearly unsettled. "Mum, what's going on?" he asked, more firmly this time. Mama Grace's shoulders dropped as she looked between them. Her lips pressed tightly together before she began. "I did something," she said. "Behind your back. I disguised myself. I pretended to be a beggar." Samson's brow furrowed. "Why?" "I wanted to test the hearts of the women in this city," she said plainly, "to see what kind of people are truly out there. I didn't want you marrying someone who only wore a mask of goodness. I wanted to see who would be kind when there was nothing to gain." Samson leaned forward, struggling to process. "And Sophie?" Mama Grace turned to look at Sophie. Her voice dropped, softer now. "She gave me her food," she said, eyes glistening. "In the rain. She didn't know me. She had nothing, but she gave her last meal. Then she carried my bag, walked me to safety, and never once asked who I was." Silence followed. Even the birds outside seemed to have gone quiet. "She didn't help me for favor," Mama Grace continued, her voice breaking slightly. "She helped because her heart is clean. I thought I was the one doing the testing, but God tested me instead. And I failed." She looked away briefly, then back at her son. "Son, this is the kind of woman I never thought I would respect. I judged her before I ever knew her name. But now I can only admire her." Sophie sat still, eyes lowered, a tear rolling silently down her cheek. Samson didn't speak. He stood up slowly, walked to the window and placed his hands in his pockets. He stared out, his reflection soft against the glass. Mama Grace stayed seated, watching her son. Sophie dabbed at her cheek with her sleeve, silent, unsure what to feel. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst, just a heavy, aching quiet. And in that stillness, something shifted again. Not in Sophie, not even in Mama Grace, but in Samson. His heart had begun to understand. The days that followed were quiet, yet filled with the unspoken. After the truth came out, Mr. Samson became more watchful, not suspicious, not wary, but attentive. He began to notice things he had once overlooked. The way Sophie wiped the table twice instead of once, not because anyone was looking, but because she believed in doing it properly. The way she always greeted the gateman by name. The way she never left the kitchen without tidying behind herself. But what truly struck him were the quiet moments. He saw how she limped slightly after walking back from the market in the rain, yet smiled and asked if anyone needed tea. How she laughed softly with the cook, but wiped her eyes alone when she thought no one could see. How she gently massaged her shoulder after carrying groceries, yet carried them anyway. And every evening, no matter how late it was, she phoned her brother Caleb. She asked if he'd eaten, if the pain in his leg was better, if the roof had leaked again. She never spoke about her own tiredness. She never asked for help. One evening, Mr. Samson stood outside by the corridor and watched her through the kitchen window. She was humming to herself, stirring a pot of soup. Her headscarf was slightly askew, flour on her hands, and a soft frown of focus on her brow. There was no pretense, no performance. Just Sophie being herself. He stepped inside. "Sophie," he said quietly. She turned, startled, wiping her hands on a towel. "Yes, sir?" He paused, took a breath, then looked her straight in the eyes. "I want to marry you." The room seemed to still. Sophie's breath caught. She looked down, then up again. I don't know what to say," she said softly. "You don't have to answer now," he replied, calm. "I just needed you to know how I feel." Sophie bit her lip, then finally said, "Sir, I'm not saying no, but I want to be sure, not just about you, but about myself." She smiled faintly. "This isn't the kind of thing you say yes to because someone is kind, or wealthy, or grateful. I need to know who I am before I become someone else's wife." Samson nodded slowly, deeply respectful. "Take all the time you need." And so, the next chapter began not of romance, but of observation. Sophie quietly began to study the man behind the title. Not as a servant, but as a woman deciding her future. She watched how he treated the gardener who spilled water on his shoes. He simply said, "Be careful next time," and smiled. She saw how he welcomed a cleaner's suggestion about reorganizing the pantry, giving credit and listening without pride. She noticed how he always asked his mother if she had eaten, how he still called her mum with respect, even after everything she had done. One evening, Sophie sat beside Caleb on their small mattress in their room. The walls were peeling slightly. Rain tapped gently on the window. "Caleb," she said, stroking his hair. "He asked me to marry him." Her brother's eyes widened. "The rich ogre." She chuckled. "Don't call him that." "Well, are you saying yes?" Caleb asked, hopeful. "I want to," she whispered. "But I needed to know what kind of man he really is." She looked away for a moment. "If I say yes," she said firmly, "it's because I know I'm saying yes to a good man. Not just a rich one." A week later, Sophie walked into the Sampson household in a pale blue dress, her hair neatly tied back, her face calm but bright. Mr. Sampson was reading a file in the sitting room when she approached. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice steady. He looked up, smiled gently, and stood. "I've thought about it," she said. She took a deep breath, met his eyes, and smiled. "I'm ready." He didn't say a word, just stepped forward and embraced her gently. But that was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Sampson quietly began putting things in motion, not to impress her, but to empower her. He enrolled her in a top UK-accredited online university, paying the full tuition up front and buying her a new laptop and study desk. Then, one sunny afternoon, he took her on a drive. They pulled up in front of a small but beautifully furnished shop on the high street. A bold sign read, "Sophie's Delight Kitchen." She turned to him, mouth open. "This is yours," he said. "The beginning of your dream." Sophie covered her mouth, shaking her head in disbelief. "But why?" He smiled. "Because I know you. You don't want to sit idle. You want to earn, to create, to give. And I love that about you." But the biggest surprise was yet to come. One morning, as Sophie was sweeping the compound, a doctor arrived. "We've secured full support," he said. "Your brother Caleb can now have his surgery." Her eyes widened. "What? How?" The doctor smiled. "Your fiancé sorted everything." She turned and saw Sampson standing by the door, hands in his pockets, a gentle smile on his face. She ran to him and hugged him tight, not out of gratitude, but out of something far deeper. A life was changing. A future was unfolding. And love had been earned. The morning light streamed gently through the window as Sophie sat beside Caleb's bed, her hands trembling but hopeful. Today was the day he would try to walk again. The room was filled with quiet anticipation, a sacred silence that only those who have faced hardship can understand. Caleb's eyes flickered open. He smiled weakly, as if sensing something new was about to begin. Slowly, with careful guidance, Caleb rose to his feet. His legs still ached, but the strength he hadn't had in years was there, somewhere deep inside. And then, the first step. One small, trembling step, then another. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the sight of her brother taking those steps. Her sobs broke the stillness. "Caleb, you're walking," she whispered. "Yes, Soph," he smiled, steadying himself. "Because you never gave up on me." That moment, the victory of a lifetime, was not just about Caleb. It was about Sophie's sacrifice, her unyielding kindness, the heart she had carried through every trial. Word of Caleb's recovery spread quickly through the market, through the neighborhood, through the hearts of everyone who knew Sophie's story. And then came the wedding day. It wasn't lavish, but it was perfect. A small, bright hall near the town center, filled with laughter, with music, with the joy of new beginnings. Friends who had once whispered behind Sophie's back now danced beside her, tears shining in their eyes. The very people who had turned their noses at her poverty now stood to celebrate her strength and resilience. Among the guests was Mama Grace, standing tall and regal, but with a softness in her eyes that no one had seen before. When the time came, she stepped forward, clearing her throat. "I once believed," she began, voice steady but emotional, "that class mattered more than kindness, that a family's name was the greatest treasure." She paused, glancing at Sophie, who was radiant in a simple dress, her hands trembling just a little. "But today, I stand before you to say I was wrong." Mama Grace's voice broke. "This girl, this wonderful young woman, showed me that the heart is the true measure of worth." A hush fell over the room as she knelt before Sophie, her hands reaching out. "From this day forward, Sophie, you are my daughter," she declared, her voice filled with pride and love. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Mama Grace, no longer the strict, distant woman she had feared, but a mother who had learned, grown, and changed. Then Sophie's gaze shifted to Mr. Sampson, standing quietly beside her, and beyond him, Caleb, walking steadily, smiling freely. She whispered softly, a prayer more than a statement, "God didn't just give me a husband. He gave me a family, a life. A beginning I never imagined." The days that followed felt like the unfolding of a beautiful dream. Sophie's Delight Kitchen became a beloved part of the community. The smell of freshly baked bread and spiced stews drifted down the street, inviting friends and strangers alike. She studied late into the night, logging into her online classes with determination, her dreams of independence and education blossoming with each passing day. But Sophie never forgot where she came from. She often found herself helping others, a woman with a struggling baby, a young man who'd lost his job, an elderly neighbor who needed a hand with her garden. Each act of kindness, small or large, was a seed planted in the soil of hardship, now blossoming into a garden of hope.